and welcome to the Daring to Dad podcast. We're talking about fatherhood, masculinity, faith, and how these things intersect. My name is Ryan. I am the host. I'm also a dad coach. I work one-on-one with dads who are looking to experience more depth of connection in their experience as fathers, less stress, more joy. But most important, I'm just curious about these topics and how they're shaping the world. Today, we're going to dive into the realm of evolving faith. If you've been following me for any time, you know that I am a former evangelical pastor. That's the world that I was raised in and shaped a lot of the views I had about the world. Today, I'm introducing you to Brian Recker. He is a former evangelical pastor as well, a writer. I started following Brian some time ago on social media where he's been making some waves talking about how his faith has evolved and changed. And I got really curious with Brian about how that informs his parenting, how he navigates parenting when your own beliefs are shifting and changing and evolving, which is a question that I get very often from dads. So I'm really excited to bring my conversation with Brian Recker to you. Please enjoy. Brian, thanks for being with me today. Thanks for carving out some time. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, man. Good to be here, Ryan.
I want to start out with this question, and this is a question I'm asking guests here just at the top. We're talking about fatherhood and masculinity and faith, evolving faith. I want to know, before we get into like what you do right in the world, I want to hear about you and some of your upbringing and how your upbringing shaped your idea of what it means to be a man and a father.
Well, I was raised in Christian fundamentalism. My dad is an independent fundamental Baptist pastor still to this day, and went to Bob Jones University. I don't know if you're familiar, if your listeners will be familiar. I also went there, kind of following my dad's footsteps. So that was kind of the world that I was in. And in general, like the parenting that I received was pretty authoritarian. My parents are really kind people, so it could have been a lot worse. Like I know people whose experience in fundamentalism was way worse, because when you kind of accompany that authoritarian style with like also just a mean temperament, which those often go together. Thankfully, at least there was a kind temperament there, but very much obedience oriented was the parenting that I received, not like a lot of connection. And so that wasn't really something that I was exposed to. It wasn't like a highly nurturing environment. I was not, I mean, I wouldn't say that there was like this, like, boys don't cry, you got to play football, like you got to look this particular way type of a thing. But it definitely was. I mean, obviously gender roles were a big deal in what I was in. Girls, my mom was a stay-at-home mom. My dad was a pastor. Women were not pastors in what we were part of. My mom wore dresses to church and that sort of thing. So very stark gender roles for sure. And so the roles were very defined. I don't think I ever really fit in with kind of the masculine stereotype. And I was aware of that. And even though nobody really communicated that to me as a deficiency, I did feel like that was a deficiency. Growing up, I think there was like a desire to please. I mean, I went to Bob Jones and my parents didn't like outright force me, but it was kind of strongly encouraged. And I had this desire to please, I think my dad especially, and be like the son that they wanted me to be. And after school, I even joined the Marine Corps, which really shocked people because people who know me know my temperament. I'm not like a big gun guy. I'm not a big like rah, America guy. I've never, in fact, when I was in school, that was the early 2000s. I don't know if you remember when like people were throwing around the term metrosexual, and I was accused of being a metrosexual. And I that felt insulting at the time. Now I look back and I'm like, that's a compliment. It just means I was better dressed than everybody. But at the time it did feel like guys shouldn't care about that sort of thing. You're supposed to look like a schlub,
Yeah.
But I think part of me joined the Marine Corps. If I could like psychoanalyze myself, I mean, it's weird. Like I almost don't know why I joined, but I think a lot of it did have to do with like a sense of wanting to prove myself, prove my masculinity, fit into a particular mold of what I was supposed to be that I knew I wasn't quite fitting. And it felt like that was like a deficiency in me, which I now see. No, I was able to, yeah, ultimately come to the place of self-acceptance and be really, really happy with myself
Yeah.
in who I am as a man, even if I don't fit into some of those kind of aggressive masculine roles. I think it nobody like spelled this out for me, but it did feel like masculinity was supposed to be more aggressive for sure. Um,
Mm.
so yeah, I don't know. As I look back on my story, I can see how I never quite fit into it, and how I kind of tried to and ultimately failed. I mean, in the sense that I ultimately, I got out of the Marine Corps, then I became a pastor, but yeah, well, this is just a long story of deconstruction.
Okay. Yeah.
When I left the church, I really do feel like I've come into myself in my most authentic way. And even when I was a pastor, I think I still experienced personal growth through that time and was able to be more myself. But really, it was outside of the evangelicalism didn't make it easy for me to be fully myself. Even I remember as a pastor, even thinking then about what I was wearing. Not like a modesty thing, certainly like the way girls have to, but in terms of like, skinny jeans or being too trendy looking. What we were a part of, I mean, I
Hmm.
know there's like the whole preachers and sneakers thing where like some pastors are like super flashy, like Stephen Furtick or
Right.
whatever, with like the
Right.
really cool clothes. But that wasn't really the vibe with what we were a part of. And so I kind of just wanted to not stand out too much, be kind of normal, not be too weird, go fishing or something like that, even though I didn't really want
Hmm.
to, because I wasn't into some of the more like male coded hobbies. I liked movies and reading. Like I liked music and stuff like that. I wasn't really into like hunting and fishing and stuff like that. But I felt like that was important for me to try those things as a means of contextualizing and reaching the men and that sort of thing. And I
Yeah.
think more and more like what we should all be doing is just, being true to ourselves. And if that
Hmm.
involves hunting and fishing, great, but it just might not.
Right. Yeah. That it kind of expressions of masculinity can exist on this spectrum, right? And this freedom to be yourself and to uh, fight and advocate for a world where everyone is free to live, their full selves and express themselves in a full way. I mean, that makes a lot of sense to me. Yeah, that's beautiful. When did things? I'm curious to know, how did things begin to shift for you? Like you mentioned a couple of times, you've mentioned the ideas of like, deconstruction. You've talked about, you used to kind of feel this way, but you don't anymore. You look back and like, what were some shifts for you in your life? Were there specific moments that you remember where things began to change, and
Oh
and
yeah.
how and what you were doing, how you were believing it, how you were living it out?
I mean, the initial one was from fundamentalism to mainstream evangelicalism because I was raised in fundamentalism at Bob Jones. I knew that I didn't fit into that mold. But I was not confident enough to make a major break. The nice thing about evangelicalism is that they essentially do have fundamentalist ideology. They have the same basic doctrine as fundamentalism within evangelicalism, but better vibes. Like you can have a tattoo, have a beer, wear jeans instead of just a suit every Sunday and that sort of thing. Like, in fundamentalism, it was just highly controlled. And so that was appealing that I could be a little bit more myself, but I was still afraid to really question a lot of the fundamental assumptions of really dogmatic fundamentalist theology. And I think my questioning started more deeply with the rise of Donald Trump in 2015, when I
Mm.
saw a lot of my church folks kind of getting behind him and my parents getting behind him. My dad, who had talked to me, like sat me down and talked to me about the importance of integrity in the Oval Office and that sort of thing, like during the Bill Clinton Monica Lewinsky scandal. Like now,
Mhm.
fast forward some years later, the same guy is telling me, like, laughing off the Access Hollywood tape as locker room talk, right? And this
Mhm.
felt like permission to question the whole thing in a sense, because it was like, wow, what a major failure of discernment from a lot of these folks. Um, I think some of that is tied up in masculinity too. It's interesting the way that Donald Trump he seems to embody like a conservative kind of masculinity that some people, I mean, I don't find him to be masculine in any, impressive way, but he has this bravado, I guess, this talks down to people and that sort of thing. It rubbed me completely the wrong way. It was not what I wanted my kids to think was okay, or what I thought anybody should look up to. And yet seeing people like get behind him and finding out that I was in the minority within evangelicalism to really be opposed to him was kind of the start of my deconstruction. But it took me some years to fully execute in my leaving. I think for a while I wanted to present an alternative. I wanted to push back against that. I wanted to show how Jesus confronted that way of being and treating people, and do that from within evangelicalism for a while as a pastor, until it really got to a point where I realized that my presence within evangelical institutions was kind of a blessing on the system that I could no longer give with integrity.
What was that like for you, like, and your family, to step out of that? What was that experience like?
I mean, it was exciting and scary. I was excited to finally be true in that sense. At the time, my wife and I were together and we were on the same page about that. And so it felt like that was, that gave me confidence that we were together in leaving evangelicalism. I don't think I knew quite how far my deconstruction would go. I think I was really uncomfortable with the white nationalism of evangelicalism. And my first thought was I probably would still pastor in maybe just a slightly more progressive church. But it really was some years of just questioning everything, something that I'm still doing in some ways. And I'm more free to not feel like I need to land somewhere in any kind of sense of certainty, like the way that I had in evangelicalism, where there was like a certainty that was required for spiritual leaders in evangelicalism. You had to have all the right answers. And I don't feel like I need to have that anymore. So that's all been very liberating. It's also been scary walking away from community, walking away from, I was within that sort of network of churches for about a decade. And so that was my family. Those were my friends. And I never said anything to try to end those relationships on the way out. But relationships within evangelicalism can be somewhat conditional, in the sense that when you don't believe what everybody else believes anymore, especially from a spiritual leadership position, or especially if you're going to talk about it publicly, like for a lot of them, it's not just that I disagree. I'm like a false teacher because I'm pretty vocal about my deconstruction, because it's not just that, I just kind of disagree. I actually see a lot of the problems within evangelicalism as very toxic and damaging to people. And I think they're worth talking about, publicly, which is obviously very hurtful for my friends who are still in evangelicalism. So they take some of that very personally, I think, even though I don't intend it personally, which is tough. And I think is one reason why a lot of people who deconstruct don't speak out, because they're still close with a lot of people who are in there and they don't want to hurt people's feelings. I don't know what gave me that sense of hubris to think that I should speak out, but it felt right and it felt true to me to be clear about it. And I did reach out. I actually wrote a letter to my former lead pastor, around the time before I started speaking out. I wanted him to hear it from me before he saw it on the internet, and I wrote a letter and just said, hey, I've shifted on some of this stuff. I'm going to be speaking about it because I was public before about what I believed, and now I think it's important to be public about the ways that what I believed before hurt people. That felt like it really felt like my integrity with that was more important than who that offended. And if they were going to be offended, that was their job to manage their emotions around that. I'm not out. This isn't personal. You don't have to associate yourself so deeply with evangelicalism that my critiquing of evangelicalism is a critique of you as a person. I don't mean these things personally. I'm just being clear about what I think these ideas do to people, But that was hard, when I stopped hearing from folks, when they took my sermons down off of the church website, when I found out that they sent out a church-wide email about me being like a false teacher, like stuff like that was hard for sure. But it also felt like confirmation. I think because I felt a real sense that I was doing what I was supposed to be doing. And so I think that made it easier to live with.
I mean, it's so wild to step out of something that you spent so much of your life making an investment into me, and this is the trajectory of your life. I mean, I know for me, like that transition out of that world, like had such a cost. You know, it was vocation, it was relationships, you know, it was purpose.
Ooh,
You know, I mean, I remember, you know, when I was a pastor and like, you know, leading worship churches, I was so clear on like this purpose that I had. I was like contributing, I had this skill set. I was bringing value to this community in this way. Like these kind of three core things were like, you know, purpose, craft, you know, bringing value to people. They were all cylinders firing away. And I didn't realize the impact of stepping away from that would have in me having to reinvent and get to know myself again, to just rediscover kind of what those like might be. I remember trying to figure out like, oh, like how does everyone else make friends? Because this is how I've made friends for
yeah,
like so long, was like it being in the church.
yeah.
And having, have you found yourself like with your kids and family having to like navigate some of these new ways of being outside of what you've done for so long?
Yeah, everything you just said really resonated with me. Um, and I, you know, as I kind of psychoanalyze myself, I'm sure part of the reason why I've been so vocal about my deconstruction is even trying to reclaim some of that purpose. And also make that time that I was in evangelicalism mean something, you know, it's not wasted time. Um, Even though I think I was ultimately building and doing the wrong thing, that can be redeemed if that time within that system is used to help other people who are leaving the system. And so that is me looking to reclaim purpose out of that. It's like a, you know, beauty from ashes, redemptive way of, I think, trying to grab a hold of that. But it is hard to, yeah, it was really tough for a while of feeling purposeless, especially, you know, getting other jobs. Like I was a recruiter for a little while, and then I was a project manager, and I'll probably have to go back into the business world at some point. And that has been a tough transition. When I was a pastor, I felt so fucking important. I felt like
Right.
what I was
Yeah.
doing mattered so much, mattered, you know,
Yeah.
pastors won't tell you this, but they think that what they're doing matters more than what everybody else is doing. Um,
Right.
uh, you know, I felt so good that I had this job that was of eternal significance, and that's a hell
Hmm.
of a drug. That was a hard high to replicate outside of ministry.
Yeah.
And I think everybody should view their life with purpose, and you want to imbue everything you do and see it so intentionally and so
Hmm.
purposeful. But I think pastors have a shortcut to get into that, almost like a,
Yeah.
you know, you don't have to find that purpose in the way that you navigate your individual relationships or your family or the way you're parenting your kids. Like you're just by nature of the fact that your job is to like sort of preach the good news that's going to save souls. Like you kind of have the most important purpose, like right off the bat. And it's easy to kind of feel a sense of self-importance. I'm really
Yeah.
speaking about myself and my emotional journey. You know, I don't think that
Hmm.
I was so self-important, but the loss of all of that was it sent me reeling a little bit in a bit of an identity crisis for a minute, which I think was important for me. I think it was good for me to sit with that and feel that loss and remember that I'm not that important and we're all just people and
Yeah.
we're all in this together,
Yeah.
and then
Yeah.
try to find purpose in my humanity, not in being so special, like being a special pastor guy, you know, like everybody's meaning and purpose it's up to us to carve that out. And we can find it in all kinds of things. And even if you find it in something mundane, that's not insignificant. And by mundane, I mean, some people there, they find a lot of purpose in particular hobbies or things that give them joy. And I think that that's okay too. Even if you believe in God, like, enjoying God's creation can be a purpose in and of itself. Like the little things can be a purpose in and of themselves. So I think as a pastor, I had to let go of needing to be it's like a savior complex a little bit, you know? Um,
Yeah.
and I don't know if that was tied to my
No,
masculinity. That's an interesting thought too.
well, no, it's, well, I think it was for me, when I look back, especially, you know, in, for me, like kind of 80s, 90s, you know, early 2000s, when I was through got college as a young, like white evangelical, like leader. like the promises that were made to me, about what it is and the importance of the role that I played in the world, and the um, opportunities that were put in front of me, the ways I was able to hide my the dark parts of myself, and the assistance that I got in keeping those like
Hmm.
in the basement to not be seen. And the ego that was built for me, like as a young pastor, and this kid, I look back, I'm like, I had no business doing what I was doing. Like it's hard because it's not all one thing. I'm grateful for some of the opportunities that I had, the people I got to meet, all those things, and you know, it built up this persona that at some point just got expanded so much that it had to pop.
Hmm.
And that had a huge impact on me as a man, where I think it actually stunted my um masculine, what some people call like a masculine initiation into the world. I remained a boy, you know, because I really had never I never confronted like myself, and only later on when I left and I had everything kind of stripped away from that, and I had to sit with just me, not the accolades of a congregation or a crowd, or everyone singing along with me or doing whatever, that I actually was like, oh man, like who am I apart from like all this stuff? Who stripped down? What is this?
Totally.
Yeah.
Yeah, that there was definitely an identity crisis, and the loss of the community, the encouragement of the community. I didn't realize how. I mean, as a pastor, you get so much. Well, unless you're a really bad pastor, I guess you get a lot of encouragement. Every week, after I'd
Yeah.
preach, I
Yeah.
had like so many people just telling me how helpful I was and how the Holy Spirit just moved through me. And you try not to let that stuff go to your head. But ultimately, when all that was taken away, I felt it like, oh, like I don't feel like I'm helping anybody. I got so much of that sense of self-worth from feeling like I was building all these people up all the time. Um,
Yeah.
and that's not a bad thing to, I think, find, aspects of your identity in giving back to people, obviously. But I think it was a moment for me to catch my breath and ask, like, what do I want and who am I outside of this?
Yeah.
And yeah, I didn't really ever have that before.
I want to shift into like how this has impacted you as a father. You have three boys, is that correct?
Yeah, so I have three little boys that live with me 50% of the time. I have 50%
Mm-hmm.
custody. And then I also have an adult daughter who's a junior in college right now.
Okay.
So,
How I know I work with a lot of people and have clients, and who talk about the challenges of raising kids in the midst of like shifting like belief, and going through some transitions when it comes to like faith in God and church involvement and all these things. Um, what are some things that you have found helpful in leading kids through some of those things, and they're watching mom or dad shift and change? A lot of times parents might not know, and their kids start asking questions about God, about these things. I know a lot of parents like, I don't really know what I believe anymore. How am I supposed to talk to my kid about those things? What are some things you have found helpful in your journey talking and working with people in that regard?
so my kids are 9, 7, and 7 now, my three little boys. And so when I left the church, I quit in 2020, about 4 years ago. They were like, pretty young, what? So 5, 2, and 2. So is that right? Or
Mm-hmm.
3. The twins were 3 maybe, and my older one was 5 or 6. And so we hadn't. I was always very, even though when I was raised, I was saved, quote unquote, when I was 5 years old. The first time that my dad told me about, heaven and hell and, choosing Jesus so that you went to heaven and not hell. And it seemed like a pretty clear choice, which it's really no choice at all. It's an absolute manipulation. I never did that with my kids. Even though I was a pastor, it didn't really feel right. Because I couldn't even put it into words probably because I hadn't really deconstructed that yet. But I never really sat my kids down and pushed them into that. I wanted them to figure that out, to kind of come to that when they were ready and want it when they were ready. And so like other pastors' kids around that age, 5, 6, were making decisions and even getting baptized, and mine weren't. And then that was, I left right around that age where like if it had gone another couple of years and they didn't, it would have been like, are you like giving them the gospel at all? Or like, what are you doing over there? But I left at the perfect time, honestly, before I had really indoctrinated them at all. So I didn't really have to undo much. I mean, they were in Sunday school and stuff, but, very, very young. And I'm really thankful because, just a few years ago, really shortly after the deconstruction and we moved, I quickly made friends with quite a few gay folks in the gay community, really good friends with actually a gay couple, 2 guys who are married and have kids that go to our kids' schools. So we spent a lot of time with them. And so they've been exposed to these, these 2 dads. And we had a lot of really good conversations in those years about the way that different families can look, about what it meant to, that people can love different kinds of people. And I remember the immense sense of relief that I had that I was able to have those conversations after leaving and after deconstructing, because I was able to make it safe for my kids to actually be honest about where they were at. So my son, one of my sons, who is probably straight based on what he seems to talk about now, but at the time, kids, they're figuring things out. And he told me that he had a crush on a boy. And I was like, cool. I didn't have to be afraid of that. I didn't have to react or like be like, oh my God, I hope my son's not gay, because then I'm gonna have to tell him to be celibate. And then I'll have to have him, tell him that he has to live a life of repentance and, carrying his cross of denying his sexuality or whatever. Like I would have had to worry about all of that if I was still within the world of evangelicalism. But instead I was able to just affirm him and tell him that, whoever he loved, he could love. And it was just such a refreshing thing to not have to put him in a box, and you can really just like let your kids be who they're going to be and be along for that journey. And so what I do when it comes to questions of God, sex, any of these things, I tell them what I think, but I often have a very open-handed approach with it. I certainly don't tell them what they're supposed to think, especially about issues of God and metaphysical questions about the universe. Sometimes I'll tell them what Christians believe, like if they're curious about that. And I think even if you remain a Christian, and I am a Christian, although I'd be quite a heretical one from many American Christian standpoint. But even as a Christian, I don't want to force Christianity on my kids. And so if I'm going to talk to them at all about quote unquote doctrine, I'll always do it in the sense of, hey, here's what Christians often believe about this sort of thing, as opposed to like, this is what you're supposed to believe. This is the right answer on this. I try to like help them lean into their own curiosity. And ultimately, I want them to come to some of those answers for themselves in a way that I wasn't really given permission to.
When I look back to, I think one of the ways that some of the subcultures that I was a part of, I think a core element of life that was completely underappreciated was curiosity, right? Like it was like you were almost warned against curiosity because curiosity might lead you to like actually start to think about other things and read some of those books that are on the church naughty shelf, that they, don't want you to read. And it sounds like you're cultivating that kind of environment where, questions are welcomed and your kids are able to watch and see and explore the world from a place of wonder, not necessarily like, this is who you are, this is who people are, this is your job, this is their job, like this very, because that really, I think that has a big impact on our kids,
Totally, man. I mean, we couldn't afford to be curious in our rigid doctrinal system because being wrong about anything meant we might go to hell. The stakes were too high to be curious. You just had to be certain. And if you weren't certain, you had to manufacture certainty.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that's not
Wild.
even faith, you know?
Hmm.
It's very artificial. And so, yeah, I think for me, like parenting them in regards to faith, I mean, we don't talk about it a lot, to be honest, because they're not that they have asked questions before, but they're not like, that's not front of mind for them. They're not like bringing that up all the time. We do go to church occasionally. I'm not even the most faithful churchgoer. I serve in kids ministry, so I'll often go when I'm on the schedule and take them back there, and they don't even like fucking pay attention. And I don't care. Like, I'm not like, no, pay attention. Like, I mean, there was so much fear in our spirituality before because it was all about like, I mean, I would have been so stressed as an evangelical if my kid hadn't gotten saved, you know, by 9 years old. It's like, oh no, what if he doesn't like walk down this path? And ultimately it's all about heaven and hell, you know, questions of like making sure you're on the right side of this afterlife line. And of course, if that's real, then that there's nothing more important than that. But I think that's really missing it. I think that's like a really shallow spirituality, is making it all about like just going to the right place after you die. I think that's misreading the entire Bible and the message of Jesus. And I think it actually causes us to be really fearful as parents, and focus on the wrong things and put pressure on our kids to become something, because it's so important that they become the right thing, because if they don't become the right thing, then they're going to hell. And so you end up forcing them, and that often pushes your kids away, and that makes them not feel safe to even be themselves around you, because if they're not becoming the
Yeah.
thing that you need them to become, you know, they'll be fake around you so that you leave them the fuck alone about it.
Right. Right. Hmm. Yeah,
And so I do.
absolutely.
Sometimes my kids are really quite more disobedient than I think I would have gotten away with, like with my parents. But I try to remind
Yeah.
myself that they feel safe with me in a
Yeah.
way that maybe
Yeah.
I didn't.
Hmm. Yeah. I'm sure you get this question a lot, as because I know I get it, and people always wonder like, what are you now?
Hmm.
What are you now? Like, what are you? And because it's helpful for us, you know, as humans, labels help us organize in our brains people, right? And they help us like create these categories in our minds, right? Which, you know, ultimately like maybe aren't as helpful, but I understand like why we do it. How do you typically like respond to that? What do you say?
So, I mean, I still call myself a Christian, but I do feel like it probably needs some elaboration, simply because evangelical Christianity is the most popular sort of form of Christianity in America. And my Christianity feels almost diametrically opposed to that at this point.
Hmm.
Um,
Hmm.
a few terms that I've found helpful: Christian agnostic is a term that gets used.
Hmm.
Christian humanist is a term from the ethicist David Gushee that I quite like, which
Hmm.
really sees Christianity as a spiritual tradition that is kind of a part of a broader humanism, and that is connected to other spiritual traditions, not holding our Christianity in such an exclusivistic way that denies other people's faiths and other people's spiritual traditions, but recognizing that it's my spiritual tradition, but the purpose is actually to serve the greater good. This is about us. We're all in this together, you know, and where
Hmm.
Christian doctrine is not actually leading into loving behavior in the world, then I think we start with love, as opposed to start with rigid conformity to doctrine. So those two
Hmm.
terms are somewhat helpful. Christian agnostic I like because when it comes to a lot of these metaphysical questions of like, did Jesus rise from the dead physically, or, you know, when Jesus died on the cross, was there some cosmic transaction that took place that caused forgiveness to happen in the spiritual realm? Like, these are metaphysical questions that we don't really have the answers to, and I'm allowed to just say those things are mysterious to me. I do have thoughts about all of those doctrines. Or the divinity
Hmm.
of Jesus is another one. You know, in what precise way was Jesus divine? And the reality is that was an up for debate question for the first 400 years of Christianity. And then they attached a formula to it, sucked all the mystery out of it. And not only did they codify it, but then they persecuted the people that didn't abide by the formula that they decided on. So they enforced their codification with violence. So, yeah, it wasn't up for debate anymore after that. Right. And so I prefer to stand on the side of mystery with a lot of those things, you know? I can still own and embrace the creeds as a sense of standing with Christian tradition, but I can also hold that, you know, a lot of those things might be metaphorical or spiritual truths to me, and it's really not that important. I'm a lot more concerned with how we live this stuff out in the world.
Wow.
Does that make sense?
I like to
what
ask.
Do you think?
It 100% makes sense. What? No, it 100%. And like, you know, I wasn't looking for any answer. It's interesting. Like for me, I've come to terms with like this idea of Christianity as like, it's my mother tongue. Like it's the language that I was taught early on about how I orient to the world. And, you know, I think I, like you, feel like, yeah, maybe we need to unpack that a bit more. I also don't feel like a lot of pressure to have to land my plane in any one place. And that was big growth for me, just to not feel like I had to have
Totally
a response to the question, like, what are you now?
Yeah. And honestly, that's
Like,
even why
I don't know. Depends on what day you catch me.
Right, totally. Like, and so some people are like, well, why not even just say you're not a Christian? It's like, well, that would be landing in a place. I've been a Christian, right? And so I'm going to remain Christian because I've been a Christian until I really feel like I cannot fit in this anymore, you know? Even though I know there's a lot of it that I can't fit in, there's a lot of it that I still really like. And so I'm going to keep calling myself that because I can and because I don't want the worst people to own the label. The reality is Christianity is still the largest religious tradition in the world. And I would hate for it to be owned by its worst elements. Jesus is too good of a spiritual teacher, and there's too much good stuff in the teachings of Jesus and in the New Testament broadly to let it be owned by a shitty fucking religion like evangelicalism.
Yeah, it's like the Christian thing. I always the term, I don't know. Someone says they're Christian, it's kind of like saying their name is Dave.
Right.
Shout out to all the Daves out there. Hey, but you know, saying your name is Dave. Hey, I've met some great Daves.
Right.
Some phenomenal Daves. Met some not so great Daves. Doesn't really describe a lot actually about you. It just says like, that's my name. So I feel like, you know, we do need to unpack some of that a bit more. But I like, I like some of your terms there. Those are helpful. And I like David Gushee too. He's a great.
But I agree with you, like in feeling like I don't have a sense of pressure to land somewhere, you know, like I feel like I can keep evolving. At some point, if I ditch the Christian label, I give myself permission to do that. I'm not like, I had to come to the place where the only intellectually honest way forward, like if you haven't given yourself permission to doubt everything, you don't really fucking believe anything. Like you've never honestly.
I agree with 100%. Yeah.
You've never honestly believed anything.
And I think that, and I think the strength of any community or culture is how they work with and create space for people to ask these questions, to doubt, to walk away, to push back, right? A community that can walk with people in that, I think that's a powerful thing. And I think, you know, you and I both had experiences where, you've been asked questions and maybe you're not waving the same banner anymore. And you realize that so many of your relationships were tied to the fact that you were waving that flag. And the minute you put it down, they're like, I don't want to associate with you anymore. You're like, okay, well, that reveals the strength of that community. That's not actually rooted in love, but it's rooted in like a mission and a thing. And I think that's where a lot of those breakdowns are, like with that kind of stuff. And that becomes, you know, really, really hard. And I know that we've been talking about a lot of things, you know, evangelicalism and I'm curious to know, there's a lot happening in the world, right? I think, you know, we scroll on social and it's like, it can easily cause, I know, parents, men, fathers, a lot of like anxiety about the future state. But this is a question I'll ask all guests that come on here is where are you hopeful about the world right now? Like what's bringing you hope? It could be like, with kids, your own life, like what's bringing you hope?
Yeah, I think the next generation is pretty dope. I'm pretty excited to see where they take us. My kids impress me continually, and they frustrate me to no end. But they often, the way that they process things so differently than I think I did at that age, because I didn't have permission to. And they already, like, it's actually really crazy when my parents come and visit, and they try to enforce certain of their authoritarian ways and try to put my kids in some of those boxes. They're like so weirded out by it. Like they're not about it. So they're going to be more authentically themselves from an earlier age. I think they won't have these, like, not that they'll have their own midlife crises. Probably every generation will have that in some way. But I feel like there were certain questions that I was only asking for the first time in my mid 30s that, like, my kids are like already have sorted out in some ways at like 9 years old,
Yeah.
Um, I've been really encouraged watching even what's going on right now on college campuses. So I recently did a reel where I stitched a segment from Fox News where they were interviewing some students who were a part of this United or Unite Us, Unite US revival thing that's happening on college campuses, where they're just, worshiping and trying to get people saved and baptized and that sort of thing. And like there was a pastor who was involved in that, who was just like, man, it's just so beautiful how, like, when there's all this like chaos going on at these other college campuses and people are so divided and so burdened, here we could just unite around love. And I found that kind of shocking that, like, in his mind, the unity was, we all just need to get people saved and baptized and converted into our religion. As long as they're all joining our religion, we'll have unity. As opposed to seeing these other students at these other college campuses who are fighting for justice, standing up, for instance, at Columbia and demanding that Columbia divest from their support of Israel while they're bombing Gaza. I love this call for justice. And I see that as true unity doesn't come from ignoring injustice. And this rising generation really understands that the unity that we actually need it's like, if it's not good for everybody, we don't have unity yet. Like, if there's no justice, there can't be true peace. And unity doesn't come from ignoring the problems and saying, hey, we just need Jesus, and as long as everybody's a Christian, it's fine. But then you only end up with a world that's good for people that look like you, act like you, and believe like you, as opposed to saying, hey, what does it look like to pursue, like, belovedness for everyone, and fight for everyone, even people that don't look anything like us. You've got students who have never been to Palestine, who maybe don't even have a lot of connections with the Arab world, but they see what's happening over there and they're deeply burdened by it. And so as a result, they're saying, we can't stand for this. And so they're standing up and putting their bodies on the line and getting shot with rubber bullets by, police officers who come to try to put a stop to it. And that passion for justice, I think, is way closer to the heart of Jesus than, a bunch of white people just getting baptized. Sorry. I don't, I mean, I'm sure some good things happen at those revival services. I don't want to diminish every aspect of evangelical spirituality. I try to find good in everybody's spirituality. Having been in it the longest, I critique it the strongest, I think some people are like, oh, you're being so harsh maybe on what they're doing, because I'm very open-hearted about other people's spirituality, right? But like, I was a part of it, so I have, like, I've earned the right to critique it, I think. But like that gives me hope, seeing that I think more and more, there is, I think, like, even the way my kids treat and think about our gay friends, they would not abide. When my son, my 9-year-old son, a couple years ago, so 2 years after I left the church, he found out that our church didn't affirm gay marriage where I was a pastor, when I was an evangelical. He asked, I don't know, it was such an insightful question. He asked out of the blue, like, the church that we were a part of, what would they have thought about Dustin and Burton, my buddies? And I was like, oh shit. Like, I was like, I had to tell him, I was like, yeah, actually what I was a part of did not acknowledge same-sex relationships. They thought it was sin. And that was one of the things that I felt uncomfortable with. And that was one of the issues that caused me to leave. And he was like, I can't believe you were a part of that. Like, he was like shocked. He was appalled that I ever would have, as an adult, that I would have been okay at any point in my life being a part of a church that would have not allowed our great friends to really be a part of it and as their full selves. Like, he was shocked. And that gives me a lot of hope. Like, it took me a long time to come to that place. And so he's being raised with such a different perspective of even what masculinity is, in that regard. Yeah.
Tell me about the man you sense you are becoming. Like when you think about you and how you're evolving as a person, what, where is that?
I'd like to say I'm becoming more humble. I I think I had to own a lot. I mean, to deconstruct publicly is so change is humbling. I think a lot of people don't change because it's not just scary, but it's humbling because you have to admit that you were wrong, especially to change in really obvious public ways. I mean, it's even the reason that, like, I mean, you could say this about small things. It's why, like, right now the pant style is moving away from skinny jeans to like wider leg. But there are some of us who are just like, I can't do it because like they saw me in skinny jeans last week. And if I show up in like a wider leg jean, then they'll all like see me change. And it's like a humbling thing to change, right? It's like a scary thing to all of a sudden be a different guy, to show up in a different way. But I realized that the way that I had been was like so far off from what it was to be a loving person. And so I had to make some really dramatic changes and own that I was like a part of the problem for a long time. And I think that has given me like the capacity doing that in such a radical way. I think I'm hopeful that it gave me the ability to continue to do that and never stop. Because what I would hate is like, oh, I shifted and now I've landed and it's like, I'm good now and I don't need to listen anymore. I don't need to be curious anymore. I hope that what I actually gained is an appetite for never being, okay to just say this is now who I am and who I'll always be, but to always be willing to receive new information and continue to change and often own mistakes. I repent to my kids all the time. And I hope that that's one thing that they're learning from me is that it's just okay to be wrong and just, you got to just own it and admit that you're wrong and take accountability and move forward. So yeah, I hope that I'm a man who can change in that way and who listens to people and especially people that have like really different experiences from me. I am a straight white guy. I try not to beat myself too much over that, but what I think that means is, to acknowledge your privilege and to recognize that it's like extra important to listen to people that have really different experiences because not that the world is always easy for us, but the world was built for us, straight white guys, patriarchy, heteronormativity, and white supremacy are three factors that are real and that mean that a lot of the social forces in the world work to my favor. And so that just means, it doesn't mean that I need to like be apologetic for being who I am, but it does mean that I need to be listening to other people and trying to include other people where I can. And all my sons are, I don't know how straight they'll be necessarily. They're still pretty young, but they're definitely white guys at this point anyway. And so I hope that they're getting an example of that as well. I don't want to just add three, more douchebags to the world. I want to hopefully bring three humble men who want to like lift other people up into the world, and so hopefully I'm modeling that for them.
Brian, this has been great. Thanks for chatting and just sharing your huge heart for the world, for people, for your family, your sons, your daughter. I want to give you just a chance to tell people like where they can connect with you, what kind of work you're doing. Tell us a little bit about that.
I'm primarily publicly on Instagram at BE Recker, RECKER, BE Recker. On Instagram, I do a lot of deconstruction content and talk about evangelical spirituality and point things out. So it's, if you don't have that background, you might find it somewhat odd or alienating, but if you've had any experience in evangelicalism, you may find some of what I'm saying to resonate. At the moment, I am writing a book about hell, actually, and about how central that black and white dogmatic heaven and hell afterlife focus really corrupts evangelical spirituality and makes it really difficult to love. And so I'm the spirituality that I was shaped in was a spirituality about avoiding fear, about avoiding punishment. It was a spirituality of fear and hell. And what I'm finding is that really infiltrated the way that I view God, the way that I view others, the way that I view myself. And so I'm trying to now replace that with a spirituality of love and connection. And so that's what the book is about. And so that will come out sometime at the end of next year. I'm still finishing up the first draft right now, so you can keep your eyes open for it.
That's exciting, man. Very cool. Congrats on that endeavor. Excited to see what you put out in
Thanks,
that
man.
regard. Hey, man, wishing you and your family all the best. Thanks again for jumping on the Daring to Dad podcast, man. Really appreciate it.
Appreciate you, dude.
Absolutely. Hey, thanks so much for watching, for listening. If you enjoyed it, one way you can support my work is by subscribing, by sharing, all of those things. Thanks so much. I'm incredibly grateful for your support.